Today is February 21st, 2019. My name is Rebecca Lubetkin, and I have the privilege today of interviewing Dr. Margarida West, mostly known to friends and associates as Guida. Guida was born in 1927 with an identical twin sister in São Paulo, Brazil, and lived most of her adult life in the New Jersey suburbs. And now I want to welcome you, Guida, and ask you if we could start from the beginning, how your family history in Brazil and your coming to the U.S. Shaped your life and your interests and your feminism.
Thank you, Becky. I'm honored to be here, and I just wanted to say that my life in Brazil, my early life and early years, had a significant impact on my entire activist life. I was raised in a country that was ruled by a dictator, Getúlio Vargas, and my family on both sides were very political and against the government. So I lived in an environment of political activism. My uncle was periodically thrown in jail for trying to overthrow the government. I lived through revolutions in Sao Paulo. And so politics was a theme that my father would always say to me, don't talk politics to anybody. Don't stay out of politics because it's too dangerous. At the same time, I would hear stories about my American family being very politically active in the War of the States.
Oh, in the Civil War.
In the Civil War.
Your earlier family was from the United States?
They were from Mississippi and Georgia, and they were Southern rebels that left the United States after they lost the war. And they came to and settled and created the American village outside of the city of São Paulo. It's called Americana. American village was called Americana. And so on that side, there was a lot of lessons to be learned about political activism. On the other side, my mother was a rebel also. And her brother was a rebel, always involved in politics.
They were Brazilian?
They were Brazilians. One was American and one was Brazilian. My mother died when I was very young. I was 2 years old, so I didn't have much influence from that, even though I was very tied to my Brazilian family. But the thing that I observed in my childhood was in terms of gender, class, and race. Let me talk about class first, because we were upper middle class. We were very comfortably lived. We had a big house, and it was situated in an environment where there was a lot of poverty around us, because they were building, and they would have shacks of poor people around that were doing the building. And as a child, I became very involved with the children, and I could never understand why they were barefoot, they had no clothes, they lived in a mud-floored hut, and I lived in this big house on the hill. And that consciousness, I remember asking my father, because I liked playing with him, and I asked my father, why doesn't Elvira have shoes? Why does she live in a mud floor shack? And we have all these rooms in the house. And he would say, when you grow up, you'll understand. And so that was not acceptable. I realize now it created a contradiction in me that I couldn't understand. The second one, in terms of race, we had servants, everybody there that was the haves have servants, and most of them were black. And we had one special servant, Desu, that was remarkable. He was a genius, absolute genius. He taught himself English. He taught himself engineering. He could play the piano. We took lessons in piano, could never play anything. He was a sculptor. He would sculpture things. He was a real genius. He never had a chance to go to school, never had a chance to develop his abilities. And that I confronted my father again. Why doesn't Desu go to school? Why didn't he get an education? We're getting the best education. We were going to a private school. And we had all the drama. That racial contradiction of why me as a white person and Desu as a black person, there was such a differential. And this, I was 7, 8, 9, 10 years old at the time. And the last one, in terms of gender, what really was a seed planted at that time was that I was surrounded by relative women, and one of their major conversations was the violence that they endured. My stepmother, sister would periodically come after being battered by her husband, and she would stay with us and then go back to him. My neighbor that was extremely wealthy one day appears at our door with her 2 children and asked to stay with us. Her husband had beaten her up. It apparently had been, he was the president of one of the big corporations, international corporations. And they would sit, my relatives would sit around and talk about battered women that were abused. And I integrated that idea that when you got married, it was the luck of the draw. If you got a man that beat you or didn't beat you. And I remember when I was walking up the aisle, I thought, oh, thank God I found a man that doesn't beat me. And, but anyway, so those contradictions shaped why I started to move. When I got to Barnard, I then took some courses, and what I got out of Barnard was tremendous ability to organize, being able to have the confidence and being encouraged to organize. We organized a group of us, a math committee, a Spanish committee, a library committee. I mean, we did all kinds of things that gave you the self-confidence. If you want to do something and get something done, organize. That created a tremendous source of energy for me as I moved on. Then I went to Columbia for my graduate work, for my master's, and I took a course in race relations. I was for my master's, and it really opened up my eyes, and I started to understand the relationship, my relationship in Brazil with blacks. I felt we were very good people, masters in the slaves, but we were very good masters. That's the way I had been brought up and the way I felt. And I learned how patronizing that we had been, and that we supported the system and never challenged the system. And that bothered me. And my professor, Bernhard Stern at Columbia, was called before the House of Un-American Activities during the Joe McCarthy era. And because he had written an appendix to the classic book, the study, An American Dilemma, which was funded by the Ford Foundation, and they enlisted the help of Gunnar Myrdal, a famous sociologist from Denmark, to study the race problem in America. And Bernhard Stern, Professor Bernhard Stern, was asked to write an appendix on discrimination against women. And it's called Appendix 5. And so I read that. It was like, you know, opening up my realization of how much I had to learn about race relations and gender relations. I had never seen or felt that I was discriminated, because class-wise, I had all the resources. Anyway, when I got married and we moved to Metuchen, in order to have a place where I could meet people that I might like and socialize with, I joined the Presbyterian Church. I was not a religious person, but it was an easy way to meet people that you might be compatible with. And as a result, what I used the resources of the church to organize the involvement of the church in the civil rights movement that was starting to bloom in the early 60s. And in fact, I became one of the original members of the Race Relations Council in Metuchen and Edison. And I was very, very active in the Fair Housing Committee, in the Public Relations Committee, in the Education Committee, and I was given an award. I have the award plaque here, but I was given an award for my work in brotherhood. They called it brotherhood, and so my activism in civil rights really was a base of my beginning of being very much of a public activist. And at that time, I was asked to be on the Presbyterian Church and Race Committee, which was a very big honor. There were only 20 people invited from the country to be on it. I was invited to be on it. And I went to their first meeting, and they welcomed us, the chair welcomed us, and then he said there was one other woman there, a black woman, and myself, and he said, I am going to tell you that your women are welcome, and we urge you to participate in every part of our discussions and issues, but when it comes down to the vote, the women can't vote. And the black woman, I can't remember her name, she just got up and said, I'm sorry, I'm leaving. And she left. And I was young, I was in my 30 or something. I didn't have the courage to walk out, so I stayed. But it really bothered me, because what could I do? I'm a woman, you know. And that was the beginning of my political consciousness starting to, rise. Then I was very active in my Presbyterian Church. I was on every board. I was taught Sunday school. I did everything. My husband did nothing. He was immediately put on the session, the ruling body of the church. And so it bothered me, I kept saying, you're just involved in ushering or something like that. I'm involved in all of these things, and I never get asked to be on the session. So at one point, I finally confronted my minister, and I said, what about women and on the session? And he said, oh, Guida, no, our church is 250 years old. We've never had a woman on the session. That's impossible. And I said, but I've been traveling and talking all over the state on the Church and Race Committee, and I see women on session boards. And they said, oh, no, our church will never have women. So anyway, we had a congregational meeting. The way you get on the session, they present a slate, and if there's any, then they ask, are there any nominations for the floor? So the day this was going to happen, the night this happened, I got up the courage to call up a woman friend of mine and ask her, would you be willing to participate if I nominate you? And she said, oh, I don't know. And I said, please say yes. Her name was Mary Weber. And she was the wife of the mayor of Metuchen. And so anyway, on that night, when they said, are there any nominations from the floor? I stood up and I said, yes, I nominate Mary Weber. And he said, Guida, she's a woman. And I said, yes, I know she's a woman. And then it was dead silence, and then he said, she's going to be very lonely there. I said, okay, so I'll nominate two. And I nominated another woman, and they were both voted in. So I cracked the ice there. And then right after that, we moved to Montclair to be nearer John's job at Hoffman Rouge. And, we had accomplished a lot. We had, one of the things that was very difficult for me when I started in the civil rights movement is that we had tremendous conflict between whites and blacks. It was very difficult, and I got accused of being a racist, and some of the blacks wanted me out, and even though I got an award later on, but at one point the tension was so great that it almost broke up the council, and I had to move and do other things that the blacks would allow me to do as a white person in the movement. And at the end, just before we were leaving, I was on the Fair Housing Committee. We had been trying for 3 years to integrate our street and our town in the center. And we showed it to, we got a black couple finally that had the courage and the resources, and they asked to buy our house, and we sold it to them. And all hell broke loose in Metuchen on May 1st, 1966. And, but anyway, at that point, they moved in, and when we moved out, just before we were moving out, the woman that had attacked me most of all, and she hadn't talked to me for 4 or 5 years, she knocked on my door and she said, and I saw her, and I said, Mary, what are you doing? Do you want to come in? I hadn't seen her or talked to her, and she said, I came here to thank you for walking the 2nd mile. And that was a real closure for me. Unfortunately, that summer, I got very, very ill, and I was out of commission for about a year. We moved to Montclair. I was unable to do very much, but I joined the Presbyterian Church, and at that time the Vietnam War was going on, and our church was becoming involved in the anti-war movement. So I became involved with the women that were doing this. At the same time, my minister asked me if I would go to Newark with a group to find out what was happening to the poor people in Newark. I had no interest, I'll be honest, at the beginning, I had no interest in going in that direction. I wanted to stay with the civil rights movement, but he asked me to go, and he put me together with a minister from Newark called Glenn Hatfield. And so I went to the meeting, and Tom Hayden was there, the organizer, and this group of black women sitting in a circle, and I was told this is a group, they're trying to organize a group of welfare women to push for their rights. First of all, I didn't know anything about welfare. I didn't know what welfare rights was. What rights do people have on welfare? But the one thing that struck with me that day is I walked in, there was an enormous poster, and I do have copies of this poster still, an enormous poster saying, "Live like a dog, 29 cents a meal." That was what the welfare program was providing for people on welfare. And so anyway, out of this meeting, they organized, and with the help of many other groups in Newark. They organized the welfare rights group, and they published. Their first job was to bring the women together to write a book on their know your welfare rights, because I started to understand that what they were talking about, the law had been passed in 1935 and amended several times to provide aid to families with dependent children, for mothers to provide for their children. And because Social Security only provided money if your husband died and he had been working, then you had Social Security, and that was okay. It was not stigmatized. But if your husband deserted you or died or had not had a job and you were not eligible for Social Security, you had no recourse. If you couldn't find a job, or if you lost your job and you had no income, but the government would give you aid to do. It was very little. The beginning was $8 a month in 1935, so it wasn't very much. But anyway, we organized. I was part of the group that helped organize with other groups, the welfare rights group of Newark. And then I came back to Metuchen and organized a group of welfare mothers in Metuchen, and pulled together some of the women that were on welfare. I did an extensive study myself to learn what welfare was all about, how it had been enacted, what the rights were, what the constraints were. But the one thing that we had a very bad time was we could not get the state rules for welfare. And we wanted to know what the rules were so we could abide by them. And we tried and tried and tried, and we'd get a letter saying, no, we don't give out the rules. We don't inform the public what the rules are. I said, well, how can you comply with the rules if you don't know what the rules are? Anyway, we got the churches in Montclair to request the rules. And so they had to send it to us. We got the rules, and in Newark, Robert Curban, who became head of the Ford Foundation eventually, was an organizer. He got a copy too. And they met every Saturday morning, and they translated the rules so they could be understandable to this little booklet, Know Your Welfare Rights. It became adopted eventually. It was adopted by the government because it was so clear. Social workers finally understood what the rules were. So that was very exciting. And then I organized here, and we had conferences because by that time the movement had spread nationally. It had become a national movement, and Johnny Tillman was a welfare mother in California that had organized her group in California without any resources at all. Incredible story, her story is. And there were groups all over the country, and George Wiley, the professor of chemistry in Syracuse University, he became so concerned. He was very much involved in the civil rights movement, and he became so concerned about the poverty of that he was witnessing, and that nothing was being done about it. And he decided, when he saw all these groups of welfare mothers organizing, that he pulled it together into a national movement, hired other organizers to go and help these groups mobilize. And this became this is 1967, 68, 69, 70, and he had read an article in the Atlantic magazine called A Strategy to End Poverty, by Francis Fox Piven and Richard Clower. They're professors at Columbia University, who said that if we teach women that need welfare to go and get the money that the government promises them, they've never been given this money. They've been always prevented from getting what they needed. There were obstacles after obstacles in the welfare departments, so they couldn't get it. So if we insist that we have rights to this, that they have rights to this and the money, if the whole system will collapse because it doesn't have enough resources. And their theory was, if the government if the system, a welfare system that we had would collapse, we could put in a new system that would guarantee a basic income, guaranteed income for families that needed it, to provide for basic housing, food for the children, health care, child care, etc. A minimum guaranteed income. And the motto of the movement then became 5,500 or fight. And it was a 5,500 guaranteed income plus jobs and training, jobs with dignity. And anyway, the Johnny Tillman was the chair of this black woman that had organized, and she became elected, the elected leader of the movement. And in 1966, when Ms. Magazine, the magazine started by Gloria Steinman, started, the first article of the magazine, I think it was the first or one of the first articles in the magazine, this radical feminist magazine, was an article by Johnny Tillman. Every woman is one man away from welfare. And it really hit it really, because if a woman didn't have a man, and she could get, if she had to work, if she lost the job or if she got ill, and then where did her income? If she had no family, where would she get any money? She had to go on welfare. And there was that danger that you're that vulnerable and so dependent on men. That became a very important part of it. And in fact, the women, one of their first conferences, we had national conferences of the movement. And one of the things, the first conference in Philadelphia, I think it was his first or second or third conference of the welfare rights movement, the men got up, and the men were all organizers. White, mostly white, some blacks, but mostly white men. And they got up and they said, our goals are to get jobs for men and welfare for women. And the head of the Philadelphia group stood up, Frankie Jeter, stood up and said, we want jobs. We want jobs and training. We also, if we can't get it, if we need money, when we need it, we want welfare. But first of all, we want jobs. That's the same thing that Johnny Tillman had requested when she organized in California. She organized by putting out handwritten posters in every door in Watts, in the poor area of California. She put in a little invitation. Would you like a job? Would you like a job? Come to this conference. Come to this meeting. That's the way she organized. The emphasis was on job and training and equal justice with the men. And unfortunately, the movement was, once it got going, and it was very successful in the first few years, of course, there's always a counter movement. And the counter movement was to destroy the system and tighten it up, prevent the women from getting the monies. there were attacks in Washington, welfare women they're lazy, they don't work, they ride on big Cadillacs, all the stereotypes. And we provided, one of the things that we did as the Friends of Welfare Rights, and by then we had expanded the Friends of Welfare Rights not only to New Jersey, but to the entire country. There was a movement, supportive movement of the welfare rights by middle-class people. And we developed with a group of welfare women myths and facts about welfare. The reality that most of the people on welfare were women and children and elderly, and that most of them were not able to work, or they recycled from, they would get a job and then a minor job, and if you didn't have any education, there were very few chances of your getting a good job. And maybe it would last 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, then they're back on welfare. The whole thing was that the system needed to be changed, and Clinton, Nixon finally accepted the idea. He was president then. He accepted the idea that maybe a guaranteed income was okay. And we had, but he was offering, I believe, $1,700 a year for a family of 4. The welfare rights movement was asking for $5,500, and in between there were about 3 or 4 different other proposals and bills passed or proposed. To make a long story short, we didn't get anything. What we got was the opposite. President Carter came in and created another bill called Better Jobs and Income to provide training and more income, etc. But that fell by the wayside too. It didn't pass. Clinton came along. He decided the way he could win is to say, we're going to reform welfare. The tide had turned from an interest in helping the poor, and you have to understand that at that moment in time also, Martin Luther King had started to move from the civil rights movement to helping the sanitation workers in the South, and he was assassinated. But he also was developing a program for poor people, a poor people's movement that emerged in 1968. Unfortunately, he died in April of '68. The movement had been planned for June of '68, but he incorporated the welfare rights goals and dreams of the welfare rights women.
Was this about the same time as you were transitioning into an academic environment?
Yeah, I was moving into academics in 1958, and I started working in 1974 at Rutgers, and 1974 was Watergate. That was another thing that was going on at the same time. And in 1974, I decided that I was so frustrated that we were losing ground in terms of what I had been fighting for 10 years, that I had to go back to school and learn how to bring about social change. So I applied for a PhD program, and I got into Rutgers because I wanted to study political sociology with Professor Horowitz, who was the top political sociologist in the country, and he was at Rutgers, and I wanted to study with him. And I went to Rutgers, and at the same time I needed to work to earn some money, so I got a job at Rutgers, a full-time job, and I was going to doing my coursework at night and during the days whenever I could. And I got this job as head of developing a program called Continuing Education for Women to provide support for women to enhance and encourage them to come back to college. And I developed it from my own imagination, what that would require. I talked to the women that wanted to come back to college but were afraid to. I said, what do you need? And they said, we need math review. We can't pass the SAT without a math review. We need child care. We need more assertiveness training. We need support for those of us who have lost husbands or been left by their husband. So I created programs to give them math review and get them through the SATs and assertiveness training. And one of the programs I created was to deal with violence. And that was an eye-opener for me, because at that point, the issue for me was education. I felt that women needed to get education if we were going to break out of our oppression. But at the same time, I became aware of some women that had to cope with being abused. And so I hired a facilitator to have a discussion group and 12 women signed up to talk. And the facilitator said, I'm going around the semicircle. We had a semicircle. And I was sitting at the end of the semicircle. And she said, I want you just give me your name, and if you know any woman that's been abused in a relationship. And when she started, I thought to myself, I don't know anybody. Well, very quickly, as she went around the room and I was the last one to speak, I realized that I knew my stepmother's sister, I knew my neighbors in Brazil I had come to Metuchen, my next door neighbor. Periodically, her husband would break furniture and beat her up, and she would come to our house in Metuchen. The head of the Civil Rights Metuchen Edison Race Relations Council, a woman that had organized the group. She was the wife of a president of Exxon, and she at one time confided me, and I helped her get away from him. And she was an abused woman, had been for 10 years. The women that I was working with in the church, in the Montclair church, a couple of them confided that they were abused by their husbands who were in the session. I mean, all of a sudden, I had at least 10 women that I knew that were suffering from abuse and had to cope with it. And all their stories are incredible stories. At that point, I think it was in 1975, the government came out with a report called Violence in the Family. And then I got that report and I read it, and it had a section on the violence against women. And so I contacted the New Jersey Commission of Women on Women and said, why do you want to work with me? And we want to set up a conference and see if we can get some support for women that have been battered. Just shortly before I did that, I had been called one night by a woman in Montclair. I just remember her first name, I don't remember her last name, but I give her credit for starting the whole movement of battered women in New Jersey. She called me and she said, Guida, do you have any room in your house? Because I take women that are running away from their abusers. I need another room. And so I took a woman in and her child for overnight, and I linked up with Sandy, and and I started to learn, what do they need? What kind of supports do they need? And I went to the Commission on Women, and I can't remember her name. I think her name of the commission was Sonia Johnson or something to that effect. And she said, yes, I'd love to work with you. So we planned a conference to bring together to see what we could do as women in New Jersey to help women that were being abused. We didn't have a name for it. So we just said, violence against women, have you come to this conference? And at the last minute, one day I'm reading the New York Times. We set a date for the conference and we developed a program, and I asked, by chance, I saw a tiny little letter in Letters to the Editor in the New York Times by two women in Texas, and it said, we are dealing with the problem of violence against women, and we put a video together of their stories. So I picked up the phone and I called them in Texas, and I got right through to them. I said, this is what we're trying to do in New Jersey. Can we have a copy of the video? And they said yes. So I spoke to Sonia, and I said, Sonia, we should make this the focus of our conference, which we did. But the video didn't arrive, and didn't arrive, and didn't arrive. And finally, about 10 minutes before we were supposed to show it, the video arrived. So we announced that we had not seen the video, we didn't know anything. We had 200 people come to the conference, and we showed the video. The video was absolutely powerful. And what we had in our packet in the conference is, if you want to work on this issue, join us for the meeting in 2 weeks, and we're going to take action. We got about 60 people at the first meeting that we joined after the conference. That was the interest. It was incredible. And they called it Battered Women. And so we adopted the name of Battered Women. We conceptualized this, what was happening as battered women. We got legislators to women lawyers to help us write a legislation that we needed, child care and transportation, training, shelters in New Jersey. And we went to Governor Byrne with and he signed. Within 2 months, we had legislation and monies for New Jersey. It was a tremendous success. We repeated, Sonia repeated the conference in Trenton a couple of months later, and we had 700 people come out for it. It was an incredible, because we were identifying that it wasn't a class issue. It wasn't only poor women. It was across the board, this violence against women. And one time, just as a coda to this battered women's movement, I live here in the Cranes Mill retirement community, and one day I'm having lunch in the cafe, and a friend of mine comes up to me and said, come over, I want you to meet somebody. And so I got up and went over, and there was this very elegant elderly man sitting at the table, and he said, and my friend said, I'd like you to meet Governor Byrne. And so I shook his hand, and I said, oh, thank you, Governor Byrne. I helped to organize the battered women's movement, and you signed it in 2 months, and we're so grateful to you. You saved the lives of thousands of women. And I'm so great. He was so humble. He said, oh, thank you for telling me this. And thank you so much for coming and to talk to me. That was really a highlight for me. And then the other thing that I did when I was working with continuing education for women is we decided that, we had to get women into politics. There are very few women going into politics. So Betsy Wright, who had worked with Clinton, had started writing about the fact that women needed to be trained to go into politics. So I went to Eagleton and talked to Ruth Mandel. I said, look, why don't we put on a program to teach women how to go into politics? Let's hire Betsy Wright. She was I had read about her. Maybe she'll come and help us, which she did. And we developed workshops, and Ruth Mandel wanted it held in the Eagleton Institute at Rutgers. They had a very nice living room, but they'd only held 80. So we put out a flyer inviting people to come to Women in Politics Conference to get training to go into politics. But it was limited to 80. We had 200 women show up. We had to turn them away. CBS, we contacted the press. CBS came and filmed it and taped it. And Lynn Sher was the moderator. She was the anchor. And it was a huge success. And it was continued because it was such a success. It was continued, repeated, and expanded all over in other parts of the country. I guess this was happening also. But that was another very big challenge.
There are two areas that I would love you to continue with. One of them is the academic. While you were working, you were...
I was getting my PhD.
Getting your PhD.
And I have to say that one day I came home. I was working full-time. I was writing my dissertation, and I was still involved in the movement. And I had a home. I had a good husband and 2 children. I came home one day after work, and I remember driving in and thought I was going to die. And I realized all of a sudden I could not continue to be super mom. I had to give up something. I wasn't going to give up a good husband who had been very supportive of me in of my work in the civil rights movement and the welfare rights movement. And I certainly wanted my children well cared for. But I came in and I said, I'm through being super mom. I'm just going to take care of myself. You're adults. My children were 14 and 15. I said, you take care. You can wash your clothes, clean, cook. I don't care. But I don't have the energy. I have to finish my dissertation and I have to do my job. And so anyway, we divided all the roles. They rebelled against it, but I insisted, and everybody was going to cook, everybody was going to clean, everybody was going to wash clothes. And we changed the whole system in our so I could continue to do the work that I had to do. And it was, my son now is a gourmet cook because he learned how to cook. And they're both activists, my children. They're, the seeds, fall off the tree, and they've sprouted.
So when did you get your degree, and how did that?
When I went in, and I told after I was invited to be part of the Department of Sociology because I was hired by Rutgers for continuing education as assistant professor, so they put me on the tenure track in the sociology department. And I was, and I told them at that time I was working with Professor Horwitz, who immediately, when I went into his class, he liked the idea that I was writing on the welfare rights movement because I was involved in it. And he said, you cannot write a PhD unless you really are obsessed with it. And I was obsessed with it. Was how did the poor women, without any resources, be able to organize a national movement? How did it, what were the things that helped? What were the things that destroyed it? And what happened? And that was my thesis, and I published my thesis as a book, the National Welfare Rights Movement, that is now out of print, but can be found on Amazon for for quite a bit. And the other book that I wrote after I did not get tenure because I didn't have enough books. I had only published one book, several articles, and I had the contract from Oxford University for a book on women and social protest, but that was not enough. So I went to work for the Institute for Research on Women at Rutgers for 2 years. But before I left, while I was in the Department of Sociology, I was told repeatedly, one, that I was too old. In a private meeting with the chair of the department, I was told right from the beginning that I was too old. I had white hair. I was too old. And they were not going to give me tenure. So that's from the first week I was there. Then I got, what they do, they give you 3 years to prove that you should continue on a tenure track. In 3 years, I had published my book. I had gotten rave reviews from William Julius Wilson, a top black sociologist at Harvard. He had praised my book and the work that I was doing. And yet, when I went up for a review, my chair of the Department of Sociology said that I did not have it to continue. Luckily, a friend of mine that was a woman, friend of mine, that was on the committee to decide, she knew that I had the letters of commendation, and what the chair of the department had done, he had taken the letters out of my folder, so when the committee got it, there was no letters of commendation. And she knew that I had shown her the letters, so she knew the letters existed. So she told the chair of the committee, Guida has been commended for her work. And this man took it out. He was chastised. He was told that what he did was a criminal act. But they gave me 3 more years, but when it came down to the vote, even my mentor, all the women voted for me, and the men voted against me except for 2 or 3, and I lost by 1 vote, and so I didn't get tenure. And I fought it, and I took it to the union, and I said it was sexist and ageist discrimination, and they gave me 2 years at the Institute for Research on Women, which provided me a chance. It was a serendipitous opportunity, because I got a call from organizers in Georgia that were organizing a celebration of Rosa Parks' 50th birthday in Atlanta. And they said, we would like, we got your name as an activist in the civil rights movement. We want to honor all the women that were involved in the civil rights movement and give them the title of torchbearers. They will be honored as torchbearers of the civil rights movement. And she said, do you know anybody that you worked with in the civil rights movement that should be honored? And I said, Laverne Lentz. She organized the Metuchen Edison Race Relations Council. And they said, would you get hold of her? I said, I have lost touch of her. But through many ways, incredible ways, I was able to finally get her number, find out she was living in Texas. She was the one that had been abused and yet organized the Metuchen Edison. And so I got her telephone, and I called her one day, and I said to her, Laverne, this is a voice from your past. Do you have time to talk? And I said, I'm Guida West. Could you talk to me? I want you to be a torchbearer for the civil rights movement, and they want to honor you at the meeting in Atlanta. And luckily, I found out in the process of getting her to Atlanta was that she had remarried and was very happily married. But the day I called her was the day she was going to her funeral for her second husband. And he said, but I had a wonderful life. So her story ends in a very good way. But she could not, she was ill, she could not go to Atlanta. I went to Atlanta and took another feminist, Gwen Kirk, who had been an organizer for the movement in and outside of London to prevent the missiles, nuclear missiles, to be set up outside of London. And Gwen Kirk was one of the leaders, and she came to the Institute to do the research and write up her story. And so I got to know her. I got to know Charlotte Budge, who became one of the big leaders and feminist leaders in Rutgers. And I stayed there for 2 years running programs for women. And at that during that time, I also completed my work, Women in Social Protest. And just as an aside, when I suggested to my mentor at Rutgers that I would like to do a book on women in social protest, he said, who would be interested in that? I mean, nobody's interested in that. I said, well, I'm interested in it. And he said, but everybody knows everything there is to know about it. You know, the abolition and all. I said, what about women in the Ku Klux Klan? What do we know about them? You know, what about the women in the welfare rights movement? What do you know about them, other than what I've written? You know, what about in every movement, whether it's liberal or conservative or wherever on the political spectrum, we never hear what the women did. Anyway, I did this. I worked with a colleague of mine, and we discovered that women were involved in every single movement. In fact, amazing, the Luddites, you know, the movement of the Luddites, women started it. We got evidence that women started it. I mean, we found evidence in Africa and Mexico and Latin America of the role of women in social movements, even some evidence that women had been instrumental in starting the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution. So this was a very energizing study that I compiled, and that's still...
Where did you go when you didn't get tenure? You were given 2 more years. And then you moved on?
After 2 years, I got, by chance, I was making some inquiries. By that time, I was 62 years old. And I thought, well, I'm going to retire. But then I thought, no, let me see if I can see anything else. And so one time I mentioned, I explored a few jobs at Rutgers. I never got any of the ones that I was interested in. And then I thought, well, I'm retiring. And I got a call from a friend of mine, Mimi Abramowitz, and she said, I met Hunter. She's a full professor, Hunter. She had written a book on welfare. And she said, you know, I'm writing another book and I need your bibliography. Would you share it with me? And I said, fine, I'll share it with you. And I went in to see her and I gave her my bibliography. And she, when we were walking to the elevators, she said to me, are you interested in working in any job? And I said, well, I think I'm retiring. But if you hear of anything, let me know. Well, about a week later, she calls me up and said, I have the perfect job for you, except you have to apply for it this moment. It was 4 o'clock. I was about to leave the office at the Institute. But she said, you have to send them their resume right now because they have 2 finalists. 2 men are vying for this position. But she said, it's your job. So anyway, I applied for it. And they gave me an interview. I had an interview at the Federation for Protestant Welfare Agencies for the job of Director of Policy Advocacy and Research for the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, which there are three. New York City is unique, and it's the only city in the country that has three a Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish organization to care for the poor. So what happened is that I was able to represent the Protestants in New York City in order to provide for the poor and needy in New York. The Catholic Charities provided for the Catholics, and the Jewish provided for the Jews. And so I worked with the three leaders of those organizations to develop, and we lobbied and at the city council with David Dinkins. We lobbied in the state with Governor Cuomo. I was able to go to meet Governor Cuomo and talk to him about the needs of poor women and children, and develop programs for them. And then we also were invited to the White House to argue against Clinton's plan for welfare reform. Now this is 1990, in the 1990s, and Clinton was running on getting welfare reform, and a new welfare reform by cutting out the aid to families with dependent children. That law had been in place since 1935, and he was going to change it. It was going to be the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. We call it TANF. And it really, one of the major reasons we opposed it is that women were going to have to work 20 to 40 hours a week in addition in order to get their benefits. This had never been part of it. They had, they were also, there was very little child care involved in it. There was very little money for transportation. It was a disaster. And anyway, at that point, I worked very hard, and when in 1995, I was there in the Federation from 1989 when I quit Rutgers and joined the Federation until 1995. I retired because of health reasons. But when I retired, I got my boss to give me an office, a computer, and I could use any of their resources in the Federation. And so I continued because we had established a group of people interested in welfare and poverty. And I had been working, I had established when I went to the Federation, I started with a program on educating people about welfare reform. The first meeting we called had 4 people that came, 4 organizations that representatives. By the time I left the Federation after 6 years, we had 100 organizations coming in every month, first Tuesday of the month, and we called it the Welfare Reform Network. The New York Times would refer people that called, where can we find out about welfare? Go to the Federation, to the Welfare Reform Network. So it was something that developed, that went on going for many, many years.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way to move to really highlight your career.
Yeah.
To be able to finish it with such triumph.
Yeah. And when I retired, I told him because the doctor told me, did I want to die for the job? And I said, no, I don't want to die for the job. And my husband didn't want me to die for the job. But so I quit. But they honored me, and it was the most moving thing I've ever. I said, I have to go, I have to leave, but I'm still with it. I will still be with it and still work with you in any way I can. And this Liz Kruger was my co-chair at the Welfare Reform Network. She is now senator, one of the elderly senators in the state of New York, which is very exciting. And she moved from that career as an activist and leader in New York City to become a senator in New York. And
So the bulk of your career, for which I'm sure you have memoirs and documents and photos, where are your papers?
they're all at the Smith Sophia collection. They called me and asked me for my papers. Unfortunately,
Do you think anybody has been looking at your papers?
Oh, absolutely. And I just got a letter this week from Maureen Callahan, the director, who wrote to me and said, your work has, my vision is very poor. I had to copy the words so I could read them. Your work has undoubtedly enriched the landscape of women's history and activism, and we are honored to steward your records at Smith. Since its arrival, your collection has been enthusiastically utilized by researchers in their scholarly explorations.
Wow.
So this to me is really, the one other thing that happened to me that was very exciting during the Federation, and then I have to say, remember one other thing, is that when I was on the Federation, I got calls to go on television. I'd never been on television before, and I didn't realize that you need some training. But anyway, I was called by CNN to, they were having a program on welfare and they wanted me to be on it. And so I was on it, what is wrong with welfare? And they had, a television with the 4 pictures, the 4 people. I was one of the 4. And they had one in California, one in Texas, one in New York, I was in New York, and then there was one in Washington. And I was debating the conservatives. And it was I almost went into a panic because I'd never experienced, I thought we were going to sit at a table, at a round table, and discuss the issue. I had no problem with the issue because I knew what I was talking about. But it wasn't. You were sitting in a dark room with a little light, and you had to keep your eye on the light in order for your face to come out on television. Anyway, as a result of that, apparently I did so well that NBC called me and asked me if I'd be on the Jesse Jackson show to debate the Cato Institute on healthcare and welfare. And so I went on Jesse Jackson show, and that was very exciting, to an NBC in Washington. And then I got called by which is the other?
ABC.
ABC called me and asked me to debate a professor at NYU, one of the famous professors that knew everything about welfare. So I debated him on there. And then the highlight for me, though, was I got a call from PBS, and they said, we are doing a special show on the war on poverty. It's going to be in 4 sections, and we'd like you to be in the 4th section on war on poverty about the welfare rights movement. And I told them immediately to call Francis Fox Piven, because they're the ones that really started this with their strategy. They said, no, we've read their works, we've read your book, we want you on the show. So they flew me to Boston. It was in the middle of winter, and it was the most exciting thing I've ever done in my life. I was sitting next to the producer and director, Fred Hampton, who had done the movie, the series, if you know the civil rights series, the Eyes on the Prize,
Yes.
which is the famous series on the civil rights movement. I was sitting next to this director, to the journalist, the head of the journalist school at Columbia University, all these authors that I had read about and quoted. And, you know, I kept thinking, what am I doing here? You know, maybe they made a mistake. But anyway, it was a wonderful experience. They came to the office, and we divided up all the work, and then they came to the office in New York, and they taped me. And so I was on, I think in 1992 or 3, I don't know the exact date, I was on PBS American Experience. And it's not that long, because there were 4 sections. They ran it 4 separate weeks, or 4 separate days. The first one was the beginning of the Depression and how the Social Security developed, and there were famous other people on these 3 other sections. And then the 4th section was on the welfare rights movement, and they filmed me to discuss the Friends of Welfare Rights, how I had been involved and how I produced. It was just 10 minutes. I think at most it was 10 minutes. But it was really an honor.
A great culmination.
And
your
I mean, to me, at the end, because I had had so many obstacles and negativism reaction to the work that I was doing on this topic for women, and yet at the end, I became validated by the Smith Collection. I was validated by PBS. I was validated in so many other ways.
Is there anything else that you want to add for us?
Yes, the one thing I forgot to say that is absolutely critical is that when I was in continuing education for women, Becky, I got a grant. I wrote for a grant with the help of my colleague Rebecca Lubetkin. We wrote a proposal to Washington and won a competitive national award of $250,000 to eliminate sexism in the public schools. And we established the Institute to Eliminate Sexism in the Public Schools, and it ran. I was involved in it administratively for until I left Rutgers, and Becky Lubetkin continued it for 25 years or more, of eliminating sexism and racism and ageism, and it was one of the most exciting experiences of my life.
And I thank you for that. That was the totality of my career.
Yeah, and this is the way we met. Becky and I met, and we both continued to be involved all our lives. But in conclusion about my life is I've been a very privileged woman. I have had opportunities that have opened up after I've been knocked down and squashed and felt like a doormat. I have re-emerged and had so many wonderful, wonderful opportunities to do something that is my life's passion, is to help women move out of poverty and violence. And I've come to the conclusion that if looking at women's lives the way I experienced my life and the experiences I had, is the bottom line is that we're on a continuum of violence from wording and language and ignorance, etc., to murder and rape and abuse. You know, a continuum of the extent of violence, political violence and physical violence, economic violence. However you analyze it, it's a matter of violence that we have to eliminate. I am thrilled because right now I've just been working with a group of women from the New Jersey 11th for Change. We were able, as a group here in Cranes Mill, to educate people on the need to get more women in politics, and we succeeded in getting Mikey Sherrill as our representative, because we had a representative, Freely Hazard, that for 30 years, and he never responded to our needs to come and talk to us. He would not answer our letters. He would not meet with us. He was not representing us. And we wanted, and we were able to organize and work with several groups here in educating people the way to keep our democracy strong and free, and we keep free, is by being participants in the process. And this is what one woman says, you're not going to rust away, you're going to wear away. And that's the way I want it to be.
Thank you so much. That fascinating life, which is continuing, and your activism is continuing, and we're very lucky for all of the gifts that you've given to the women's movement and to the country.
Well,
thank you.
I appreciate that I had the opportunity. It's not only, you know, I have a sign by my door that says crisis in Chinese. Do you know what the two emblems of the word crisis is in Chinese? Danger and opportunity. I had the dangers and the opportunity to respond.
Great.
And I carry that always with me. In any crisis, there's danger and opportunity.